3:14 a.m., October 12, 1944. Outside the village of Brière, France, Oberlieutenant Klaus Richter stood behind the thick stone walls of a centuries-old farmhouse, sipping lukewarm ersatz coffee. He felt untouchable. His 42 men were seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front, dug in with two MG-42s covering the only road. To Richter, the Americans were predictable. They followed their manuals like scripture, charging headlong into the mouth of the beast. He expected a mortar barrage. He expected a bloody, doomed infantry assault. He expected to win. In the next 6 minutes, Richter's entire command would vanish without a single shot being fired. 300 yards away, Private Arthur, or Artie Finch, lay shivering in a rain-slicked drainage pipe. The mud was a cold slurry against his chest, and his lungs burned with the scent of wet wool and decay. He wasn't holding a Thompson submachine gun or a satchel charge. Instead, he gripped a stolen signal lantern and a jagged piece of plywood. What Artie was about to do had no place in the field manual. It flipped Army doctrine on its head. In fact, his commanding officer had explicitly forbidden it, calling it a suicide mission of parlor tricks. But Artie knew something the West Point strategists didn't. You don't have to kill a man to defeat him. You just have to make him believe he's already dead. Artie Finch didn't come from a line of warriors. He came from the south side of Chicago, where he spent his youth in the cramped, dusty rafters of the Blackstone Theater. He was a stagehand, a master of the magic hour. His civilian life was spent understanding the anatomy of perception. He learned how to use a single 500-watt bulb to make a wooden set piece look like a cathedral. He learned the geometry of the mind, how a well-placed shadow could evoke terror or awe. He understood elevation, the way light decayed over distance, and how the human eye, when starved of information, fills in the blanks with its worst nightmares. When he enlisted in '42, the drill sergeants at Fort Benning were baffled. He failed his marksmanship qualification twice, distracted by the way the sun glinted off the targets. They saw a clumsy kid who couldn't march in step. They missed the fact that Artie wasn't looking at the target. He was looking at the world as a series of light trap angles and silhouettes. The Richter blockade had become a meat grinder. The farmhouse sat on a rise, providing a 360-degree field of fire that made reconnaissance a death sentence. Standard doctrine dictated a frontal assault with smoke screening, but the wind was too high. The cost of following the manual was etched in the dirt. Corporal Leo Rossi, 21, from Newark, New Jersey, lay 50 yards from the farmhouse door. He was a gifted violinist who had promised his mother he'd play at her Christmas dinner. He died clutching a bandage to a chest wound that no field kit could fix. Beside him was Private First Class Elias Thorne, just 19, a farm boy from Savannah. In his pocket was an unopened birthday card from his younger sister, a card that would remain unread for the next 80 years. Captain Sterling, his uniform pressed despite the chaos, refused to deviate. "We wait for the 75mm guns," he barked, safe in a cellar 2 miles back. "No improvised nonsense. We do it by the book or we don't do it at all." He viewed the men not as individuals, but as variables in a rigid equation of attrition. Artie Finch saw what the captain ignored. He noticed a gap in the farmhouse's stone perimeter, a narrow ventilation slot meant for a root cellar. More importantly, he saw the rising moon. If he could position himself at a specific 12-degree angle relative to the farmhouse's whitewashed western wall, he could use the moon and his lantern to create an optical illusion. He presented his plan, a ghost silhouette ruse. By using a series of plywood cutouts shifted rapidly in front of a light source, he could project the shadows of an entire platoon onto the walls of the farmhouse, making it appear as if the Americans had already breached the perimeter and were surrounding the Germans from the rear. Captain Sterling's face turned a deep, furious red. "This isn't a puppet show, Private. You'll be court-martialed for even suggesting such a mockery of our mission." Artie didn't argue. He waited for the captain to leave. Then he went rogue. He gathered his props in secret, stolen kerosene, a signal lamp, and plywood scraps. He had no support, no backup, just his civilian logic and a terrifyingly simple understanding of human fear. The mud sucked at Artie's boots as he crawled through the no man's land. The air smelled of fermented apples and cordite. He reached his mark, exactly 150 yards from the target. He checked the angle, 14 inches off the ground, 43 degrees downward. He set the lantern. His hands shook, sweat stinging his eyes despite the October chill. He checked his watch. 3:20 a.m. He lit the wick. He began the dance. He moved the plywood cutouts with rhythmic staccato precision. On the farmhouse wall, massive flickering shadows appeared. To Richter and his men inside, it looked like 30 men with fixed bayonets were leaping over their rear wall. Artie screamed at the top of his lungs, "Surrender or we level the building!" He threw a single stolen flashbang grenade into the yard. The impact was immediate. Richter, convinced he was flanked by a superior force that had bypassed his MGs, felt the cold hand of defeat. Artie exhaled, held his breath, squeezed the shutter of the lantern one last time to create the illusion of a closing circle. Inside the house, Richter shouted, "Nicht schießen! We surrender!" 42 German soldiers, including Oberleutnant Richter, walked out into the moonlight with their hands over their heads. They looked for the platoon that had outmaneuvered them. All they found was a single, mud-caked private holding a piece of wood and a lamp. Artie Finch had saved dozens of American lives and neutralized an entire reinforced platoon without spending a single bullet. The Richter blockade was over. Years later, the U.S. Army would incorporate psychological silhouette warfare into its official reconnaissance doctrine. They wrote papers on the anatomy of deception and the mathematics of light, but they never mentioned Artie Finch. The official report credited a lapse in German morale and Captain Sterling's superior tactical positioning. When the war ended, Artie didn't ask for a medal. He went back to the South Side. He went back to the theaters, hauling sandbags and adjusting spotlights for actors who would never know his name. He never told his wife or his children about that night in Brières. He had a life to live and work to do. To him, it wasn't a heroic feat. It was just a matter of getting the lighting right. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.